Because humans have some sensory understanding of our world around us, there is room to question about many things. These questions are more than likely to lead to the quest of understanding the reality that we have living on this earth. This predicament is known as the formation of the problem of God, self, and reality considerations. From a person to God perspective, the question is that is there a belief or disbelief in a God? From a person to world perspective, the question is that do we have freedom in our fates in this world, or is there a fate already written for us? Finally, from a world to God perspective, the question is that do us humans have a soul, or is the physical we experience every day is all we have? These questions and methods of thinking have caused many humans to embark on the quest to understand our human life. Some humans devote their whole lives to answering these questions and will naturally gain followers and opposers as they navigate through these processes. For example, the history of Malcolm X or Malik Shabazz is a perfect example of this journey. His documented life as a man who was aware of the harsh realities of the world around him and used his belief in God to attempt to relieve the many African Americans of their sufferings from racial equality in the mid to late 1900s. Malcolm X is an African American man that had many professions: a leader in the civil rights movement, a writer, a Muslim minister, and many more. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925 to a father that was a preacher slash black activist and an educated mother that was only able to attend school because she was white presenting. Malcolm's father died supposedly after getting hit by a streetcar, but it is apparent that he was most likely killed by local white men who feared the economic, social, and political development of his father. The death of his father caused Malcolm's mother and his seven siblings to suffer from poverty until the children were taken to the foster care system. Malcolm X was sent to prison a few times throughout his adulthood for crimes he committed due to poverty. These crimes were stealing charges, which he resorted to when local businesses denied his employment because of the color of his skin. While in prison, Malcolm X devoted his time to read every book that was available to him. Throughout his search of education, he stumbled upon the Quran and many other Muslim texts. Some of these texts included the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the lost found Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was a Muslim practice formed by black Muslims in Detroit, Michigan in 1930. The followers of the Nation of Islam believed that it was the goal for the modern African American to expel from the racism and violence they experienced from white Americans. They encouraged the African American race to migrate to Africa where their ancestors are, to gain freedom from racism and practice Islam in peace. The Nation of Islam's leader at the time, Elijah Muhammad, allowed Malcolm X to repent and swear to never repeat his sins in order to fully convert to the Nation of Islam. From there, Malcolm established the group's 11th temple in Boston, Massachusetts, and then later became appointed leader of the Nation of Islam's Temple Number 7. During Malcolm's time with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm preached to many African Americans about their superiority to the white race and their strength to become spiritually free from the social effects of slavery. There were many supporters who believe in Malcolm's direct approach to solving racism, while others believe his teachings were too radical. Malcolm's departure from the Nation of Islam came in 1964, where he claimed the church gone as far as it can. His departure was shortly after the social reputation of the group weakened from being negatively represented in the American press, criminal investigations from law enforcement, and enemies of the group. Shortly after his departure from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm started the religious practice common to Islam called Hajj. This was a practice to pay pilgrimage to Mecca. When Malcolm first arrived to Saudi Arabia to complete his Hajj, he was initially questioned for his credibility as being a black Muslim from America. Malcolm was soon to find out that he had been considered a state guest under the approval of Prince Faisal, the King of Saudi Arabia from 1964 to 1975. After completing his Hajj, Malcolm visited Africa where he would be welcomed by many of the nation's countries and even offered high-leveled political positions throughout the continent. At this point, Malcolm was in his late 30s. Malcolm and many of his affiliates state that after his religious journey, Malcolm's perspective on how to deal with racism in America changed. He said that after a spiritual reset from his Hajj, and speaking to many of the leaders of African countries, he rejected some of his old philosophies about the methods of relieving racial tensions in America. Malcolm intended to use his deeper spiritual understanding of Islam to project a new perspective of his beliefs, but was unfortunately assassinated shortly after his return to the US in 1965. Malcolm's plight for African American racial freedom through the teachings of Islam became influential to many Muslims and non Muslim people. This includes another African American civil rights movement leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King wrote in response to Malcolm's death, I always had a deep affection for Malcolm and felt that he had a great ability to put his finger on the existence and root of the problem. He was an eloquent spokesman for his point of view, and no one can honestly doubt that Malcolm had a great concern for the problems that we face as a race. Malcolm X, Malik Shabazz, was a great leader and crucial part of the civil rights movement, but I believe he made a huge impact as a religious phenomenon as well. Malcolm was a figure to refer to when religious diversity was not seen amongst the African American and many other communities in the United States. Malcolm was heavily ridiculed by the press for being part of a very underrepresented community in the world, Black Muslims. He was an advocate for expanding the idea of practicing Islam as an African American and was an ally to other Muslim dominated countries that welcomed new followers of Islam. Though I do disagree with some of the ideologies Malcolm presented before his Hajj, I believe he authentically gained deep religious insight within himself after his time outside of the US. He was ready to present his growth amongst the African American community and the rest of the world. Malcolm X showed how the search for spirituality and religious freedom is a difficult one that isn't free from mistakes. It is upsetting that he did not get the opportunity to fully express that religious journey because he was murdered by the Nation of Islam. They feared his potential to become an enemy to the group, and ultimately an enemy to the US government as a unit. Malcolm's assassination abruptly ended his potential to have made an even greater impact among the Muslim and African American communities. Malcolm X's life is a drastic example of how the quest for God through influences of the world and the internal conflict itself is a journey that is ever going.